Some folks believe a home begins with timber, nails, and a square piece of earth claimed against the wilderness. They are wrong about that. A house can stand straight for years and still be nothing but shelter from the weather. A home begins the first time one tired soul handles another with care. Grace Rawlins ran beside the eastbound stage as it pulled away from the Las Ciénegas depot, her boots slipping in the powdery New Mexico dust. Wait, the driver never turned. 6 horses strained into their harness, wheels rattled over the sun-baked road, and the coach dwindled beneath a sky white with August heat. Grace stopped beside a warped bench where somebody had abandoned a red tin lunch pail. She had no trunk, no carpet bag, no coin purse worth opening. Only the gray dress she wore, a bonnet gone limp with sweat, and 2 work-roughened hands hanging empty at her sides. The ticket agent locked the depot door behind her. "No loitering after sundown," he said. "I'm looking for employment. Try Santa Fe." "I cannot get to Santa Fe." "That sounds unfortunate." A man loading feed sacks into a buckboard looked over. He was tall and spare, with dust on his shoulders, and a brown hat pulled low enough to shade a face weather had pared down to hard lines. A little girl sat on the wagon seat behind him, silent beneath a straw bonnet, clutching a cloth rabbit by one ear. Grace crossed the road before her courage failed. "Sir, I was told there might be ranch work here." The man rested a sack against the wagon bed. "What kind?" "Whatever needs doing." His gaze traveled briefly over her empty hands. Grace lifted her chin. "I brought nothing but my hands," she warned. He looked at the blisters split across her palms, then at the child watching from the wagon. "Hands," he said, "are what the place lacks. Before we follow Grace down that dusty road, tell us where you are listening from. And should this story touch something tender in you, please like it, share it, and subscribe. It helps these old frontier memories find another warm fire to sit beside." The man's name was Micah Fletcher. He did not offer it until they had gone nearly a mile. Grace sat on the rear plank of the buckboard among sacks of cornmeal, lamp oil, fencing staples, and a bolt of brown calico. The road climbed through a country of low juniper, brittle grass, and red earth, cut by dry arroyos. Heat shimmered over distant mesas. Each turn seemed to carry her farther from every place where a woman might knock on a door and ask for help. The little girl sat beside Micah, her cloth rabbit tucked under one arm. "This is Nell," he said. Grace waited for the child to look back. She did not. "My name is Grace Rawlins." Micah flicked the reins. "You cook? When there is food, wash. When there is water, milk. Yes, ride well enough not to blame the horse." His mouth shifted, though it did not quite become a smile. "What wages are you expecting?" "A room, meals, and $12 a month." 8, 10, 9. "Until I know whether you are worth 10. Grace watched the back of his neck, sun-browned above a faded collar. 9. "Until I know whether the ranch is worth staying at." This time, she saw the smile. It was gone almost before it arrived. "This is not charity," he said. "Good. I have never known what to do with charity." The Fletcher place lay 5 miles north of town, where the land rose toward Blue Hills. The first thing Grace noticed was the fence. 3 rails sagged near the wagon gate, and one post leaned so badly that a steer could have breathed on it and escaped. The second thing she noticed was the silence. There were hens scratching beneath the porch, 2 sorrel horses in the corral, and a milk cow switching flies beside a nearly empty trough. A windmill stood beyond the barn, but its wheel did not turn. The water pump by the kitchen door had a rag tied around its handle. Laundry hung stiff on the line, as if it had been forgotten there days earlier. The house itself was built of adobe, low and broad, with a deep porch running along the front. Its walls held the afternoon cool, but the rooms inside felt airless. Dust filmed the window glass. A Bible lay unopened on the parlor table. One chair faced a coal fireplace. Another had been turned toward the wall. Grace saw no woman's shawl on a peg, no sewing basket beside the lamp, no flowers pressed into a cup. only a blue china plate displayed on a shelf above the stove, its edge chipped clean through the painted roses. Micah carried the sacks inside. Your room is off the washroom. He opened a narrow door. The chamber held a rope bed, a washstand, one nail for clothing, and a window looking onto the woodpile. A dead moth rested on the sill. It will do, Grace said. You have no belongings? I told you what I brought. His eyes settled on her face as though he understood she had answered only half the question. He did not press. Supper that evening was beans warmed from a blackened pot, salt pork, and biscuits left hard beneath a cloth. Micah ate without comment. Nell broke her biscuit into crumbs and lined them along the edge of her plate. Grace tasted the coffee and nearly winced. It had boiled long enough to tan leather. Who has been cooking? She asked. I have. That explains the coffee. Micah lifted his eyes. Yes, that's your first complaint. It is my first observation. Nell looked from one adult to the other. One corner of her mouth twitched. After supper, Micah carried his plate to the basin. You start tomorrow. Grace tied on an apron she found hanging behind the door. I started when I sat at the table. She heated water, scrubbed the dishes, and set beans to soak for morning. When she tried the pump, the handle clanged uselessly. The pump is broken, Micah said from the doorway. The leather cup is dry, and the hinge pin is slipping. It is broken. Grace studied the mechanism, found an iron nail in a tin above the stove, bent it against the hearthstone, and drove it through the loose joint with the back of a spoon. Then she poured a dipper of water into the pump throat and worked the handle. The pipe coughed twice. Rusty water spattered her dress. On the fourth stroke, a clear stream struck the basin. Nell stepped closer. Micah looked at the nail. That will not hold forever. No, Grace said, but it will hold tonight. She washed the dishes in clean water. Before sunrise, she woke to the sound of an axe striking wood. Micah stood at the chopping block in the gray light, splitting juniper logs with a rhythm that seemed less like work than punishment. He wore no coat, though the desert morning carried a sharp chill. Each swing landed hard enough to make the hens scatter. Grace rolled up her sleeves. The smaller axe. He nodded toward the barn. She found it with a cracked handle, wrapped the split with rawhide, and joined him. She did not try to match his strength. She split the straight pieces, stacked the logs bark side upward, and left space beneath them so rainwater would run through instead of rotting the bottom row. Micah paused to wipe his forehead. You stack wood differently. My father said a careless woodpile tells winter where to hurt you. Micah glanced at the neat rows. Your father ranch? Farm? Where? Missouri. He waited. Grace swung the axe again. The blade bit cleanly through cedar. By breakfast, there were biscuits soft enough to open with 2 fingers, fried potatoes with onions, and coffee taken from the heat before it turned bitter. Nell ate 1 biscuit, then another. When Grace spread a third with sorghum, the child hesitated. You might have it, Grace said. Nell looked at Micah. He nodded. She wrapped the biscuit in her napkin instead. For later, Grace asked. Nell pressed it close to her chest. Grace understood hunger that did not disappear merely because food had reached the table. She said nothing. The first week passed through her hands. She washed blankets until the water ran black. She boiled the laundry, scrubbed shirt collars with lye soap, and rehung the line where it caught the clean western wind. She swept mouse droppings from the pantry and moved the flour barrel onto bricks so damp would not creep through the floor. The hens had been laying beneath the barn. Grace built nesting boxes from broken produce crates, lined them with straw, and scattered ash where the birds could dust themselves free of mites. Within 4 days, she was gathering twice as many eggs. She patched the corral gate with a length of baling wire and replaced the missing latch with a curved piece of horseshoe iron. She turned the garden soil after supper. Most of the summer plants had died, but she found 2 struggling pepper vines and a row of beans hidden beneath weeds. She carried dishwater to them in a bucket and built a shade screen from willow switches and a torn feed sack. Micah watched these changes without praising them. He noticed, Grace knew he noticed, because nails began appearing where she needed nails. A new axe handle leaned against the woodpile, and one morning she found a sound pump hinge pin laid beside her plate. Nothing was said about any of it. Nell followed Grace from room to room, but rarely spoke. She was 8 years old, thin through the shoulders, with dark hair. Micah tied each morning in whatever strip of cloth he could find. The ties were uneven. Once he used a piece of harness leather. Grace showed Nell how to gather eggs without startling the hens. She let her knead biscuit dough and did not complain when flour covered the table. One afternoon, Grace found the cloth rabbit beneath a porch with its belly torn open and the sawdust stuffing trailing into the dirt. Nell stood in the doorway, dry-eyed and rigid. "Did a dog take it?" Grace asked. Nell shook her head. "Caught on a nail." Another shake. Grace sat on the porch step and I meant him. Nell looked toward the barn, where Micah was fitting a new shoe to the sorrel mare. "Mama made him." It was the first full sentence Grace had heard her speak. Grace picked up the rabbit gently. "Then we had better use small stitches." In the washroom, she searched for a needle. The sewing box on the shelf held only thick black thread and a packet of bent pins. From the pocket hidden inside her skirt, Grace took a silver thimble darkened with age. Nell touched it with one finger. "My mother's," Grace said. "Is she dead?" "Yes, mine too." Grace threaded the needle. "I know." They sat together by the window. The rabbit's cotton body had faded from white to the color of old flour. Grace pushed the stuffing back inside, closed the tear, and strengthened the weak seams beneath both arms. Nell watched every stitch. Will it break again? Most things do. The child's face tightened. Grace smoothed one cloth ear. Then we mend them again. That evening, Micah found the rabbit sitting upright beside Nell's plate. His hand stopped on the back of his chair. Nell touched the new stitches. Grace fixed him. Micah looked at Grace. "Thank you." The words sounded unused. She passed him the potatoes. "You are welcome." 2 weeks after Grace arrived, Micah came into the kitchen with blood running down his forearm. A young bay gelding had shied while he repaired the corral fence. The wire had sliced him from wrist to elbow, opening a ragged wound. Grace pushed aside the bread dough. "Sit. It is shallow. It is dripping on my clean floor." He sat. She washed the cut with boiled water and carbolic, though he clenched his jaw when it stung. His arm was brown and muscled from years outdoors. There were older scars along it, thin white lines crossing sun-dark skin. Grace laid clean linen over the wound and wound the bandage firmly. "Not so tight," he said. "You still have feeling in your fingers." "Yes." "Then it is not too tight." Nell hovered near the table. "Is Papa going to die?" Micah answered too quickly. "No." Grace tied the bandage. "Not from this." Nell looked unconvinced. Micah reached for her, but the child stepped back before his hand touched her shoulder. Pain crossed his face so briefly, Grace might have imagined it. That night, after Nell had gone to bed, Grace found him on the porch trying to repair a bridle one-handed. She took it from him. "I can sew leather. You have done enough today." "The bridle does not agree." He watched while she worked the awl through the thick strap. Crickets sounded in the grass. A half-moon rested above the barn roof, and the windmill stood black and still against the stars. "You always work after everyone sleeps?" he asked. "It is quieter." "You afraid of quiet?" "No." He waited. Grace pulled the wax thread through. "I'm afraid of owing too much." Micah leaned back against the porch post. "A person can drown in things owed." It was the nearest he had come to speaking of himself. She finished the stitch and handed him the bridle. "Who did you owe?" He ran his thumb over the repaired leather. "My wife." Grace said nothing. Micah looked toward the dark fields. Clara was carrying another child. "The doctor told her to rest. I told her calves do not wait for doctors." His voice remained level, which made the words more painful. A storm broke the north fence. I rode out. When I returned, the baby was gone, and she was bleeding. She lived 3 days. Grace's hands became still in her lap. Micah, I knew she was weak. I left anyway. You did not make the storm. I made the choice. The porch boards creaked beneath his boot. The last thing she asked was whether Nell had eaten. Not whether I was there, not whether I was sorry, whether Nell had eaten. Grace thought of the child wrapping biscuits in a napkin. When did she die? 2 years ago next month. And you have been punishing yourself ever since. His eyes turned hard. You speak plainly for someone employed $9 a month. You pay for my work, not my silence. For a moment she expected him to send her inside. Instead, he stared out at the dead windmill. I did not hire you to mend me. No, Grace said. You hired my hands? She rose, leaving him with the bridle across his knees. The next morning, Micah repaired the loose board beneath the kitchen window before she could mention it. The ranch was called Cottonwood Draw, though only 3 cottonwoods survived along the dry creek. Its 400 acres carried cattle in good years and worry in bad ones. That summer had been one of the bad years. The stock pond had shrunk to a brown oval. Cattle crowded the muddy edges, bawling under the heat. Micah and his hired man, Jonah Pike, drove half the herd north toward a leased pasture with better grass. Jonah was a bow-legged man with a yellow mustache and a habit of speaking to horses more politely than he spoke to people. He studied Grace from beneath his hat. You the Newhouse woman? I work wherever work is needed. She repaired the west gate, Micah said. Jonah looked at the gate, then at Grace. Well, that gate has defeated 3 men and 1 mule. The mule had the better plan, she said. Jonah laughed so loudly Nell came running from the henhouse. Micah did not laugh, but later, Grace saw him looking at the repaired latch as if it had personally surprised him. During the cattle drive north, Grace remained at Cottonwood Draw with Nell. She rose before dawn, milked the cow, fed the hens, and hauled water to the garden. She whitewashed the pantry walls and scrubbed soot from the stove. She mixed clay and straw to patch a crack in the adobe near the chimney. At the barn, she found harness straps dried almost to breaking. She cleaned them with soap, warm tallow over the stove, and worked it into the leather until it softened beneath her fingers. Nell carried rags and asked questions. Why do you put fat on it? Leather gets thirsty. Can wood get thirsty? I have a rice. Can a house? Grace glanced toward the open kitchen door. I believe it can. What does it drink? Voices, footsteps, supper cooking. Somebody coming back at night. Nell considered this. Our house must have been near dead. Grace did not deny it. They hung the newly washed curtains in the kitchen. The cloth had once been white, but was now the pale cream of old bone. Grace hemmed the frayed edges, Nell found blue thread, and stitched one crooked flower near the bottom. When Micah returned after 4 days, trail dust covered him from hat to boots. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The curtains moved in the evening wind. A jar of yellow wildflowers sat on the table. Stew simmered on the stove with carrots, beans, and a small piece of beef Grace had stretched with barley. Micah removed his hat. What happened in here? So what? Grace said. Nell ran to him, then stopped several feet away as if some invisible rein had pulled her back. We made flowers. She pointed to the crooked blue stitching. Micah walked to the curtain and touched the thread. Looks like rain, he said. It is a flower, Nell told him. Then it is the finest flower I have seen. Nell's face opened. Micah looked at Grace over the child's head. Something passed between them, quiet and cautious. At supper, he ate 2 bowls of stew. Afterward, Grace found a narrow wooden shelf newly mounted in her room. It stood level above the washstand, sanded smooth, with 3 pegs beneath it for her dresses. Micah was outside unhitching the wagon. She walked to the barn. You built a shelf. You needed one. I did not ask. No. He loosened the harness from the mare. Grace waited for him to say more. He did not. "Thank you," she said. He nodded without facing her. That was the beginning of their gentleness, though neither of them would have called it that. It arrived in ordinary disguises. When Micah rode into town, Grace kept coffee warm on the back of the stove, though he never knew when he would return. When rain threatened, he brought her laundry inside before the first drops struck the dust. She mended the torn pocket of his work coat. He left the coat on its peg long after the weather warmed, touching the new stitches whenever he passed. He began bringing Nell to the kitchen in the mornings with her hair brushed. The ties were still uneven, but they were ribbon now, not harness leather. At the table, Grace served his food before he asked. Micah started waiting until she sat before he ate. One evening, he returned from checking cattle and found Grace asleep in the rocking chair with a stocking draped over one hand and Nell curled against her side. The lamp burned low. The child's cheek rested on Grace's shoulder. Micah stood in the doorway for a long while. Then he took the shawl hanging beside the stove and laid it over them both. Grace woke when his fingers brushed her wrist. He pulled back, as if the contact had burned him. "Nell should be in bed," he said. "As so should you." He lifted his daughter. Nell did not wake. Her arms went around his neck by instinct, and Micah closed his eyes. Grace pretended not to see. In September they went to town for flour, lamp oil, garden seed, and the heavy blue cloth Grace needed to make Nell a winter coat. Las Ciénegas was little more than two crossed streets, a church, a smithy, the depot, a saloon, and Bell's Mercantile with its porch crowded by barrels. Mrs. Bell stood behind the counter, broad-bosomed and sharp-eyed. She watched Grace measure cloth. "You are the woman Fletcher picked up at the depot?" "Grace Rollins," Grace said. "So I heard." Mrs. Bell rolled the cloth slowly. "Folks have been wondering how a woman comes west without so much as a trunk." Grace's fingers tightened on the fabric. "Misfortune travels lighter than most people expect." A woman near the button display smothered a laugh. Mrs. Bell lowered her voice, though not enough. "A respectable woman usually has somebody willing to speak for her." Micah entered carrying a sack of feed over one shoulder. He set it down. "Grace Rollins works at Cottonwood Draw." Mrs. Bell straightened. "I am aware you asked for someone to speak for her." His voice was quiet. "I'm speaking." The store seemed to draw inward around the words. Mrs. Bell folded the cloth. "I meant no offense." "Then use her name next time." Grace looked at him. Micah did not meet her eyes. He picked up the flour and carried it outside as if he had merely commented on the weather. On the buckboard home, Nell fell asleep between them. The road ran gold beneath the late sun. Micah drove with one hand while the other rested loosely on his thigh, close to Grace, but not touching. "You did not have to defend me," she said. "I know. Mrs. Bell will talk twice as much now." She talked enough before. Grace watched the mountains turn violet. What if she is right? About what? Then running from something. Micah's hand tightened on the reins. "Are you?" "Yes." He waited. Grace looked down at her palms. The blisters had hardened into calluses. "My father owned 40 acres near Independence, apples, corn, 2 milk cows. When he died, my brother Emmett took charge. He borrowed against the farm, then borrowed again. By spring there was more bank than soil in the place." "What happened to your share?" He said daughters did not have shares, only needs. Micah's jaw shifted. "He sold the farm. Told me a family in Santa Fe had paid my passage and wanted a housekeeper." "There was no family. The man who met the train in Kansas City wanted a wife he had already purchased from Emmett." Nell stirred in her sleep. Micah's voice dropped. "What man?" "Caleb Wren, a cattle buyer." "Did he hurt you?" "He tried to keep my ticket and trunk." "I kept the ticket. He kept the trunk." "That why you came west with nothing?" "I had the dress I wore and my mother's thimble." "Why not go to the law?" "I did. The deputy asked whether my brother had accepted money. When I said yes, he told me to honor the arrangement." Micah stared down the road. Grace saw anger settle into him, heavy and controlled. Caleb ran. Know where you are. I do not think so. You should have told me. You asked whether I could cook and milk. You did not ask whether a bad man knew my name. You live beneath my roof. I work beneath it. The words struck harder than she intended. Micah's face closed. They rode the rest of the way in silence. For 3 days he spoke only when work required it. Grace matched his distance. She baked, cleaned, hauled water, and helped Jonah reinforce the south fence. She moved her few things from the shelf into a flour sack, though she could not have said whether she was preparing to leave or merely reminding herself how little there was to pack. On the 4th morning, a black buggy came up the road. The man driving wore a town coat despite the heat. He was heavy through the middle, with a silver watch chain and boots too polished for a ranch. Harlan Voss, president of the Las Ciénegas Bank, entered the kitchen without removing his hat. Micah met him at the table. Grace worked dough at the counter, trying not to listen. The note comes due in 6 weeks, Voss said. I know the date. Your herd is down. I know my herd. The northern lease cost more than expected. Micah's reply was too low to catch. Voss opened a leather folder. Sell me the spring pasture. It will clear the interest and buy you another year. The spring feeds half my cattle. Half your cattle might not survive winter. Nell sat near the stove, holding her rabbit still. Voss looked around the kitchen. I hear you have hired help now. Grace pressed her knuckles into the dough. I pay my obligations, Micah said. You have always been proud of that. Voss snapped the folder shut. Pride is expensive land to graze. After he left, Micah saddled the bay gelding and rode out without eating breakfast. Grace found the bank notice under his plate. The amount due was $386, more money than she had ever possessed. That evening she began a ledger. She counted eggs, flour, lye soap, lamp oil, and every jar in the pantry. She calculated what the garden might yield before frost. The next morning, she asked Jonah to bring her the damaged tack from the bunkhouse. You plan to fix all that? He asked. I plan to sell what my hands can do. She mended bridles for neighboring ranches. She took in laundry from the school teacher and the railroad clerk. She sold eggs to Mrs. Bell, who paid 1 cent less per dozen than promised, until Grace looked her in the eye and asked whether the mercantile's reputation was worth 12 cents. Mrs. Bell paid the full amount. Grace dried peppers, canned beans, and baked bread for the Saturday market. Nell painted small flowers on paper labels, each one uneven and bright. Micah saw the coins accumulating in a crock above the stove. What is that? Money? I recognize money. Then we have made progress. He lifted the lid. Silver and copper glinted inside. You are working yourself thin. The bank does not accept rest as payment. This debt is mine. This ranch feeds me. I pay your wages. Some months you too. His face darkened. Grace wiped flour from her hands. You missed August. I know. So let me help. I did not bring you here to carry my failures. You brought me here because the pump was broken and your child hid bread in her napkin. The instant the words left her, she regretted them. Micah became very still. Nell stood in the hall. Grace saw her, but too late. The child's eyes filled. She ran to her room and shut the door. Micah looked at Grace with a pain so deep it resembled fury. Do not use her against me. I was not. You were. He set the crock down hard enough to crack its rim. Grace pulled off her apron. I will leave at the end of the week. Micah's breath stopped. Grace, you need a worker who does not speak plainly. I did not tell you to go. You did not have to. She walked past him before he could see her eyes. For the next 2 days, they moved around each other like strangers, sharing a station platform. Grace packed the flour sack. It held one spare dress she had sewn from brown calico, A comb Nell had found beneath the parlor cabinet, 2 pairs of stockings, and the silver thimble. Nell would not speak to her. On Saturday morning, Jonah hitched the buckboard to take Grace to town. The sky hung low and gray, promising the first cold rain of autumn. Grace put her bundle on the wagon. Micah stood by the corral, working a length of rope through his hands. She waited for him to come over. He did not. Jonah climbed onto the seat. "Seems foolish," he muttered. "Drive," Grace said. The wagon moved through the gate. Rain began in scattered drops, darkening the dust. They had gone 20 yards when Nell ran from the house in her nightdress, barefoot and sobbing. "Grace!" Jonah pulled the reins. Nell reached the wagon and held up the cloth rabbit. One ear had torn loose. Grace closed her eyes. Micah came through the gate. Rain streaked his shirt and ran from the brim of his hat. He did not look at Grace. He reached into the wagon, took down the flour sack bundle, and carried it toward the house. Grace stared after him. "What are you doing?" He stopped in the road. "The room is yours," he said. "Micah, not because of wages, not because of debt." Rain struck the hard ground between them. He looked at her then. "You belong at the table." It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was simply the truest sentence he knew how to give. Grace stepped down from the wagon. Nell pressed the rabbit into her hands. Grace knelt in the mud and gathered the child close. Behind them, Jonah turned the buckboard around without being asked. That evening, Micah sat at the table while Grace repaired the rabbit's ear. Nell leaned against her shoulder. "I am sorry," Grace told the child. Nell rubbed her cheek against Grace's sleeve. "Papa forgets to eat too." Micah looked down. Grace threaded the needle. "Then I will remind both of you." She glanced at him. "If I stay, my work is mine to give." He nodded. "And you do not get to call every kindness a debt." His mouth tightened. "That might take practice. I am patient with stubborn animals." Nell smiled. Micah looked offended for half a heartbeat. Then he laughed. It was a rough sound surprised out of him. Nell stared, and then she laughed too, higher and brighter. Grace joined them until the kitchen, which had forgotten such noise, seemed to wake around it. The cold rain lasted 3 days. Water drummed on the roof, filled barrels beneath the eaves, and softened the garden beds. Grace put pots beneath 2 leaks. Micah climbed into the attic and patched the roof with tarred canvas. At night, the wind pushed smoke down the chimney. They moved their chairs close to the stove. Grace read aloud from the Bible. Not sermons, only stories Nell chose. Ruth gleaning in the fields, David watching sheep beneath the stars, a lost son coming home. Micah repaired tools by lamplight. One night, Nell fell asleep on the rug. Grace lowered the Bible. Micah's hands rested around a wooden plane. "She has not slept near the fire since Clara died," he said. "Why?" Clara's chair was there. Grace looked toward the chair that had been turned to the wall since her arrival. "I asked that why it faces away, yes? I turn it back." Micah stared at the chair. The fire settled with a soft collapse of embers. Finally he rose, took the chair by its back, and turned it toward the room. The seat cushion held a faint hollow where another woman had once rested. Micah laid his hand on the worn fabric. "I loved her," he said. Grace's chest tightened. "I know. I do not know what it means that this house feels less dead with you in it." The words were quiet and uneven. Grace looked at Nell sleeping between them. "It means the living are still here." Micah's eyes met hers. Neither moved. Then Nell sighed in her sleep, and the moment folded itself away. When the rain cleared, the country changed. Grass lifted green beneath the cottonwoods. Water ran briefly through the draw, shining like poured metal. Grace and Micah worked side by side to deepen the garden channels. She planted winter onions, turnips, and spinach. He built a fence around the beds to keep out rabbits. Nell carried seeds in an apron pocket. At the barn, Grace helped Micah replace a rotten stallboard. He held the plank while she drove nails. "You swing too close to your tomb," he said. "My tomb has survived this long. Your tomb has not met that hammer. She struck the nail squarely. Neither have you. Their shoulders brushed. Grace felt the contact through 2 layers of cloth. Micah did not move away. Neither did she. By October, the kitchen curtains had been joined by a braided rug, a second lamp, and 3 jars of dried flowers on the mantel. Grace moved the Bible from the parlor table to the kitchen, where people might actually open it. Micah built now a proper school desk from pine boards. Grace made a cushion for the chair. On Sundays, they rode to church together. Folks watched them enter, but Micah's public defense at the Mercantile had changed the nature of the watching. Mrs. Bell greeted Grace by name. Jonas sat with them, though he sang every hymn half a note lower than the congregation. After church one Sunday, Harlan Voss approached Micah beside the hitching rail. The payment remains due November 1st. I remember. I can give you until spring. If you sell the pasture. No. Voss's eyes moved toward Grace. Sentiment is a poor business partner. Grace stepped closer. Then it is fortunate Mr. Fletcher has me. Voss smiled without warmth. Have you told her how little remains after the bank takes its share? Micah's face hardened. Grace put one hand on his sleeve. Come home. It was the first time she had used that word aloud. Micah looked at her hand. Then he looked at the wagon where Nell waited with the cloth rabbit in her lap. He turned away from the banker. 2 days before the note came due, Jonah found water beneath the old windmill. The pump shaft had seized years earlier, and Micah had abandoned it after 3 failed attempts to repair the gearbox. Grace climbed the tower while Micah stood below, telling her to come down. The upper bearing is crooked, she called. The ladder is rotten. So is the bearing. Grace. She leaned across the frame, tied herself with a rope, and drove loose a rusted bolt. The wind caught the blaze. The wheel lurched, groaned, and began to turn. The pump rod rose once, then jammed. Grace climbed down with grease on her face. It needs a new bearing collar. That must be cast in Santa Fe. My father repaired our mill with a wagon hub. Micah shook his head. A wagon hub is not a bearing collar. Ideas, round, iron, and cheaper than losing cattle. They worked until sunset. Jonah cut the hub. Micah filed the opening. Grace heated the metal in the forge and shaped the inner ring while sparks rose into the darkening air. At dawn they mounted it. The windmill turned. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the pipe beneath the tower shuddered. Muddy water coughed into the trough, followed by a steady, clear stream. Nell shouted. Jonah threw his hat into the air. Micah stood beside Grace, both of them wet to the knees from the overflowing trough. You were right, he said. She cupped a hand to her ear. I did not hear you. You will not hear it twice. The new water meant he could bring the northern cattle home. It meant he no longer needed to lease pasture. It meant something to the bank, but it did not mean enough. On October 31st, Micah rode into town with every dollar from the sale of 6 steers, Grace's market crock, and Jonah's offer of 2 months' wages returned. They were still $79 short. Voss spread the coins across his desk. I will take the spring pasture. No, then I take cottonwood draw. You will have the rest by January. The note says tomorrow. Micah stared at the banker's pale hands. Voss leaned back. There is another possibility. Abner Knox wants your bay stallion. He offered $150 last spring. Micah's expression did not change. Grace knew the stallion. Solomon had been bred by Micah's father and raised from a foal. He was the foundation of every good horse on the ranch. He is not for sale, Micah said. Voss began gathering the coins. Then, perhaps the ranch is. Grace caught Micah's arm outside the bank. Sell the spring pasture. No, right. It is where Clara is buried. Grace released him. He had never told her. Micah looked toward the livery stable where Solomon stood in a shaded stall, black coat shining, head lifted proudly above the door. My father gave me that horse the winter before he died. Grace understood then. The choice was not between a horse and land. It was between two graves, two pieces of the past he had mistaken for the whole of himself. You do not have to decide today, she said. The bank decides tomorrow. That night, Micah went alone to the barn. Grace watched from the kitchen window as he stood beside Solomon's stall. He rested his forehead against the horse's black neck. She did not go to him. Some griefs could not be shared merely because love had begun to grow nearby. At sunrise, Micah saddled Solomon. Nell ran onto the porch. "Where are you taking him?" Micah looked at his daughter, but no answer came. Grace knelt and put an arm around Nell. Micah rode to the Knox ranch. He returned at noon on a borrowed gray mare, carrying an envelope in his coat. Nell was waiting at the gate. "Where is Solomon?" Micah dismounted. "He has a new pasture." "You sold him." Eyes. Her face crumpled. Micah crouched before her. "I am sorry. He was Grandpa's." "I know." "Then why?" Micah looked toward Grace standing on the porch. "Because the dead should not cost the living their home." He gave the bank its money that afternoon. Afterward, instead of returning directly to the ranch, he went to the county recorder's office. He came home after dark with a folded document inside his coat. Grace had kept supper warm, but she was angry. "You should have told me before you sold Solomon. It was my decision." "That is the answer you give whenever you are afraid to be known." Micah removed his hat. "You wanted me to save the ranch. I wanted you to let us stand beside you." He laid the folded document on the table. Grace did not touch it. "What is that?" "A deed to what?" "The house, the barn, the garden, and 80 acres surrounding them." Her breath caught. Micah spoke carefully. "In your name?" Grace stared at him. "You sold your horse and gave away your land." "I did not give it away." "What do you call this?" "Payment." "I will not be purchased." His face tightened with hurt. "That is not what I meant." "Then say what you mean." Now stood in the hallway, listening. Micah looked at his daughter and then back at Grace. "Your work saved this place before my horse did. Your money went into the bank with mine. Your hands repaired the pump, the gate, the harness, and half the things I was too tired or proud to see were broken." Grace felt tears press hot behind her eyes. Micah pushed the deed toward her. "No man gets to take your home because he decides you have no share in it. Not your brother, not a banker, not me." Grace put both hands flat on the table. "You cannot place a home in my name and expect that to explain your heart." "No." His voice lowered. "But it is the best proof I have." Grace looked at the deed. The ink was still dark where the clerk had written Grace Rollins. Micah did not touch her. He did not ask for an answer. He went to the barn to care for the borrowed mare. Grace stood alone beneath the kitchen lamp, one hand pressed to her mouth. Winter came early. The first snow fell during the second week of November, dusting the hills and whitening the roof. Wind drove fine powder beneath the doors. Micah stuffed cloth into the cracks and banked earth against the foundation. Grace made Nell's blue coat and lined it with flannel from an old petticoat. She knitted mittens from gray wool. For Micah, she sewed a new inner pocket into his coat and placed the folded deed there. He found it the next morning. "I thought you might keep it," he said. "I am keeping it safe. You did not sign, I know." The deed required her acceptance before witnesses. Micah nodded. He did not ask again. Their closeness changed after that. It did not disappear, but it became careful. Grace slept badly. Some nights she heard Micah walking the porch long after the fire died. Some mornings his coffee sat untouched until it went cold. She wanted to tell him that the deed had frightened her because it offered the one thing she had trained herself not to desire. She wanted to tell him that his coat on the peg, his boots beneath the bench, and the sound of his axe before dawn had become the shape of safety in her mind. But she had once trusted a brother who spoke of duty while selling her future. She could not place herself in another man's hands merely because his were gentler. Micah seemed to understand. He waited. In December, Caleb Wren came to Las Ciennegas. Grace saw him first through the mercantile window. He stood beside the stove talking to Mrs. Bell, broader than she remembered, with a dark beard trimmed close to his jaw. He wore the same green waistcoat he had worn in Kansas City. The sight of it brought back the locked hotel room, his hand around her wrist, and his voice telling her Emmett had already been paid. Grace stopped on the boardwalk. Micah was across the street loading flour. Caleb turned. Recognition moved slowly across his face. "Well," he said, coming through the mercantile door, "there is my missing bride." Grace did not step back. "I was never your bride. You accepted passage bought with my money. My brother accepted your money. That makes little difference." "It makes every difference to me." Men on the boardwalk began to listen. Mrs. Bell appeared in the doorway. Caleb smiled. "I have come a long way for what is mine." Micah crossed the street. Grace saw him reach for the anger that had protected him most of his life. She put out one hand before he could pass her. "This is mine to answer." Micah stopped. Caleb looked him over. "You Fletcher, I hear. She works for you." Grace spoke before Micah could. "I do not belong to either of you." Caleb's smile vanished. "You owe me $40 for the ticket, $20 for the trunk, and $100 your brother borrowed against the marriage. I never signed an agreement. I have Emmett's mark. You can marry Emmett then." A few men laughed. Caleb seized her wrist. Micah moved. Grace moved first. She drove the heel of her free hand beneath Caleb's nose. His grip loosened. She twisted away and struck his wrist against the porch post. The sheriff stepped from the saloon. "That is enough." Caleb held his bleeding nose. "She is my contracted bride." The sheriff looked at Grace. "Is that true?" "No, got papers." Caleb produced a folded agreement. The sheriff read it, frowning. Grace saw her name at the bottom, written in a clumsy hand. "That is not my signature." Caleb laughed. "You expect these people to believe a woman who arrived with nothing." Micah stepped beside her, not in front. "Yes," he said. "Only that?" The sheriff looked from one face to another. Grace reached into the pocket of her skirt and removed the silver thimble. "My mother carved her initials inside this." She handed it to Mrs. Bell. "E.R." the storekeeper read. "My mother was Eleanor Rollins. She taught me to form my letters the same way she formed hers, with the tail of the R crossing back beneath the name." Grace took the contract and held it up. The forged signature had no crossing stroke. "This was written by my brother. He always made the R like a fence post. You might compare it with any letter he sent." Caleb lunged for the paper. The sheriff caught his arm. Micah remained still beside Grace, though every line of him wanted violence. Grace turned to Caleb. "You bought a promise from a man who had no right to sell it. Take your complaint to him. You cost me money." "No. Your greed cost you money." The sheriff folded the agreement. "You will come with me until we sort this out." Caleb looked at Micah. "You think she will stay once she has enough saved? Women like her are always running." Micah's hand curled. Grace slipped her fingers into it. He looked down, startled. She did not let go. Caleb was held overnight and placed on the morning train east. Sheriff Talbot advised him that forged marriage contracts were not viewed kindly in the territory, especially when half the town had witnessed him laying hands on a woman. Mrs. Bell offered Grace a cup of tea after it was over. Grace declined. She and Micah rode home through falling snow. Nell sat between them wrapped in a buffalo robe, unaware of most of what had happened. Halfway to Cottonwood Draw, she fell asleep against Grace. Micah drove in silence. At last he said, "I wanted to break his jaw. I noticed. You stopped me." "I did." Why? Because I needed you beside me, not arrested across the street. His eyes stayed on the road. You did not need me. Grace watched the snow gather along his coat sleeve. Yes, she said, I did. Micah toward her. The gray mare continued at a steady walk. Grace slipped her hand beneath his arm and held it there until the ranch lights came into view. On Christmas Eve, the chimney caught fire. A bucket of creosote ignited shortly after midnight. Flames roared up the flue and spread beneath the roof before Micah smelled smoke. He carried Nell outside wrapped in a quilt. Grace ran barefoot into the snow, then turned when she remembered the kitchen. Leave it, Micah shouted. The bank papers are inside. Grace! She pulled her shawl over her mouth and went back through the smoke. The kitchen glowed orange. Burning plaster fell beside the table. Grace reached Micah's coat, snatched the deed from the inner pocket, and turned toward the door. A roof beam cracked. Micah appeared through the smoke. He seized her around the waist as the beam fell across the room, scattering sparks. They stumbled outside together. The northern side of the roof burned bright against the black sky. Jonah rang the iron triangle until workers from 2 neighboring ranches arrived with shovels, wet blankets, and barrels. Mrs. Bell came from town in a wagon with Sheriff Talbot. Even Harlan Voss joined the line, passing buckets from the well. Grace pumped water until her hands bled. Micah climbed onto the roof and chopped through burning shingles. Once, the edge collapsed beneath him. Grace saw his body vanish in smoke. Micah. He caught the eave with one hand. Jonah and Talbot pulled him down. By dawn the fire was out. Half the kitchen roof was gone. The pantry had burned through. Snow lay black with ash. The kitchen curtains were little more than scorched strips hanging from the rod. Grace stood in the yard holding the deed against her chest. Nell came beside her, wrapped in Mrs. Bell's coat. The ice are home gone. Grace looked at the broken roof, the soaked walls, the dishes shattered beneath fallen plaster. Micah stood near the porch with one arm hanging strangely at his side. His face was gray from smoke and pain. Grace went to him. Your shoulder, it is out. Sit down. He tried to argue. She pointed to the porch step. Even half burned and barefoot in the snow, she could still make him obey. Sheriff Talbot held Micah steady, while Grace guided the joint back into place. Micah made no sound, but his face went white. Afterward, she wrapped his arm against his chest. He looked at the deed in her hand. You went back for that? I went back for our papers. The word reached him before she realized she had spoken it. Our. Grace looked toward Nell. The child stood beneath the ruined kitchen window, holding her rabbit by its newly mended ear. Grace unfolded the deed. The edges had singed, but her name remained clear. I will sign it, she said. Micah stared at her, but not as payment. No, and not because you believe you owe me. I do not know how to stop owing you. Then learn. He gave a weary, broken laugh. Grace moved closer. You proved I could stay without being owned. You let me stand beside you in town. You gave me land when you could hardly bear to lose another inch. And when the roof fell, you came through the fire after me. Micah looked at the ruined house. I nearly failed to reach you, but you came. She took his uninjured hand. I brought nothing but my hands. His fingers closed carefully around hers. They made a home? No, Micah. We did. The neighbors rebuilt the roof before New Year's Day. Jonah repaired the rafters. Sheriff Talbot hauled shingles from town. Mrs. Bell brought flour, coffee, and a set of second-hand dishes with blue flowers around the rims. Harlan Voss arrived with 2 panes of window glass and said nothing about sentiment being poor business. Grace fed everyone from a cook fire in the yard. Nell carried nails in a tin cup and lost half of them in the snow. Micah worked one-handed until Grace caught him lifting a roof brace and threatened to tie him to Clara's chair. You would not, he said. Jonah looked at her. She would. The new kitchen was smaller, but warmer. Micah built a long pine table from the boards that survived the fire. Grace sanded it smooth, now painted another crooked blue flower beneath the edge, where only the family knew to look. When the walls were finished, Grace made new curtains from the cloth, intended for her second dress. They were pale yellow and caught the morning sun. Micah protested. You need the dress. I need light more. He brought her another bolt of cloth from town the following week. Dark green, yellow suits you better, he said. Grace smiled. Is that your first compliment? It is an observation. In January, before Sheriff Talbot, Mrs. Bell, Jonah, and Nell, Grace signed a deed. She wrote her name slowly, the tail of the R crossed back beneath Rollins, exactly as her mother had taught her. Micah watched the pen move. After the witnesses left, he found Grace on the porch. Snowmelt dripped from the roof. The repaired fence ran straight toward the pasture. Beyond it, cattle grazed beneath a clean blue sky. Micah stood beside her. I have something else to ask. Grace waited. He rubbed his thumb against the porch rail. There is no proper way for a man like me to say this. There are many improper ways. Avoid those. He almost smiled. I loved Clara. I will always love her. I know. I thought keeping the house empty was a kind of faithfulness. Grace looked through the window at Nell setting 3 bowls on the table. It was a kind of grief. Micah nodded. You did not replace her. I would not try. You made something new. The winter sun lay warm across the porch boards. My faced her. I cannot promise never to be stubborn. That would be dishonest. I cannot promise I will always know how to be gentle. You are learning. I can promise you will never be sold, sent away, or made to earn your place at my table. Grace's eyes filled. Micah reached for her but stopped before touching her. Stay after the wages run out. What? His voice dropped. My wife, if you can bear a man who took too long to understand what home was. Grace let the silence remain between them. She had learned that silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was room being made for a truthful answer. She placed her hand in his. I will stay as your partner. My fingers tightened. And your wife, if you ask properly. He lowered himself onto one knee on the porch boards. Grace laughed through her tears. Grace Rollins, will you marry me? Yes. He rose, and she touched his face with both hands. Micah kissed her slowly, not as a man claiming something owed, but as one receiving what had been freely offered. Inside the house, Nell dropped a bowl. Did she say yes? She shouted. Grace rested her forehead against Micah's. She heard. Now here's a mouse breathe in the barn. The child flung open the door. Did you? Grace held out one arm. Nell ran into it. Yes, Grace said. I did. They married in the small church at Las Ciénegas in early spring. Grace wore the dark green dress. Nell carried a bundle of yellow desert flowers, tied with the same blue ribbons she had once worn crooked in her hair. Jonah stood beside Micah and cried so openly that Mrs. Bell gave up pretending not to see. After the ceremony, they returned to Cottonwood Draw. The woodpile stood high and orderly beside the house. The hens scratched beneath new nesting boxes. Horses leaned over the repaired corral fence. Water flashed from the pump and ran cold into the trough. The garden rose had begun to green. Laundry lifted on the line. A new barn door hung straight on iron hinges, and every latch closed cleanly. At sunset, they ate roast chicken, potatoes, beans, and warm bread at the long pine table. Nell fell asleep in her chair with one hand around the cloth rabbit. Micah carried her to bed. When he returned, Grace had poured coffee into 2 cups and placed them on the porch rail. The repaired house glowed behind her. Yellow curtains moved in the open window, and the smell of bread and wood smoke drifted into the evening. Micah sat beside her. Grace rested her tired hands in his lap. He turned them palm upward, tracing the scars, calluses, and thin pale lines left by fire, wire, winter, and work. You warned me about these hands, he said. I did. You made them sound like very little. They were all I had. Micah lifted one to his lips. They were enough. The last light faded across the New Mexico hills. Somewhere beyond the fence, a horse stamped softly. The pump handle creaked in the wind, and the house settled around the people inside it, no longer thirsty, no longer silent. Some homes are built with timber and earth. Others are built from bread shared without counting, wounds washed without judgment, and hands that learn when to work, when to defend, and when simply to hold on. At Cottonwood Draw, gentleness did not arrive all at once. It was mended there, one small stitch at a time.